Hello and welcome to the tutorial for DxLogic, an iOS application designed to aid in the diagnosis of illnesses through evidence-based statistical reasoning. Let's get started with an example. A 45-year-old gentleman is presenting with chest pain and you are worried they are having a myocardial infarction. They admit to having 4 cardiac risk factors and you wonder how much does this increase his probability of having an MI? To answer this question, we need to find the diagnostic strength of the presence of 4 cardiac risk factors to rule an MI. Let's start by clicking on Specialty and then on Cardiology. We then scroll down the disease processes until we reach myocardial infarction. We can see that there are many subgroup populations we can choose from, but let's choose regular myocardial infarction. In this subgroup, the only test category is history, which is what we want, so let's click on that. Now we have a list of the diagnostic strengths of common questions on history for myocardial infarction. We can arrange them by best to rule in, or best positive likelihood ratio, or best to rule out, or the best negative ratio. For example, let's arrange them in the order of best rule in. We can see that the best to rule in was both arms with pain. Next, let's arrange them by the best to rule out. We can see that the absence of any cardiac risk factor is the best rule out test. Okay, we were interested in 4 risk factors, so let's click on that. This reveals the calculator screen. We can see that the strength of a positive test for myocardial infarction, or positive likelihood ratio, is 1.7, with a confidence interval ranging from 1.4 to 2. Before we can say how good this test is, we need to select the probability of the patient having a myocardial infarction before we even order the test, or the pre-test probability. We do this by moving the slider. Let's say he had a 20% chance before our test. As you can see, given that he has 4 risk factors, his probability is now 30% of having an MI. If you click on the button next to the likelihood ratio, the screen will display the negative likelihood ratio and perform the calculation. Here, the negative likelihood ratio is 0.9. We see that having less than 4 risk factors is not a very good test. For a few diseases, the app will also suggest pretest probabilities from the literature. If we click on the pretest probability button, we are brought to these suggestions. He is 45, so we select the cell with a suggestion of 3.5%. The application then recalculates with this initial probability. If you're curious, you can check the details of the study that the likelihood ratio is coming from by clicking the Details button. For the extremely curious, clicking Reference will pull up a link to the paper. These can be accessed on PubMed via Safari or with QXRead if already installed. Next, I'd like to show you how we can access the disease pretest probabilities. Let's say we are presented with someone with nephrotic syndrome and we're wondering what the most likely causes are. First, let's click back on the Home button. Now, click on Presenting Complaint under the Prevalences heading. Click on Nephrotic Syndrome. Let's say the patient is elderly, so let's select over 65. And here we are. We can see that membranous GN, amyloidosis, and minimal change disease are the top contenders. You can also see a little arrow next to membranous GN. This means that there are tests whose strength are known for membranous GN in the app database. Clicking through, we see that the PLA2R antibody is an excellent test to rule in and rule out idiopathic membranous GN. Finally, let's talk about the combination test section of the app. For a small one-time fee of $2, you can get the app to calculate many useful scoring systems and their associated likelihood ratios. For example, let's say we are interested in the likelihood a patient in our office who has a systolic murmur has severe aortic stenosis. So let's click on the aortic stenosis score and put in his clinical findings. We then calculate the probability with that score, and we see that his clinical findings have a very good positive likelihood ratio for ruling in the diagnosis of severe aortic stenosis. That concludes our tutorial. Thanks for downloading the app, and please leave a review in the App Store if you've been finding it useful.